Hello, my name is Ruben Albers. I'm a PhD student at the University of Siegen, and I'm going to present the paper Let's Talk About Death, Existential Conversations with Chatbots. That's a paper I've written together with my co-author Marc Hassenzahl, who is also from the University of Siegen. Together, we noticed that people don't talk much about death. And that is because death is taboo in many societies. At the same time, this takes the opportunity from people to discuss the choices that would make their deaths personally meaningful, consistent, or dignified. Of course, we are not the first ones to notice this. The death awareness movement has been around for a while and tried to encourage people to talk more openly about death. And for good reasons too, because avoiding death makes it more frightening. Talking about it can actually stimulate personal growth and lead to a more conscious and meaningful life. So we asked ourselves the question, what can HCI contribute to an open approach about death? And of course we have already contributed something because we have lots of research on Thanato technologies and also how we deal with death online. Some people consider social networking sites today's largest death educators, simply because that's the place where we encounter and maybe sometimes discuss death. However, we also know that discussions on social media can be superficial and often unpredictable. An alternative could be computer-assisted conversations about death. They could offer personalized instructions, immediate feedback, and an anonymous conversation. This is an understudied area in HCI. With only a handful of studies, there's only a palliative care coach from Utami and colleagues. Other than that, we really don't know much about conversational agents that address existential topics. So we asked ourselves the question, can talking with a specially designed chatbot facilitate a constructive confrontation with one's own death? And I'm going to tell you a bit about the chatbot that we created, the study that we conducted, and what we found. So, as I mentioned, we constructed a chatbot with a conversation around 4 death-related topics. End-of-life planning, so what could I do to prepare for my own death? What do I consider an ideal death? And what meanings do I ascribe to it? And what hopes do I have for my afterlife and legacy? And we wanted this chatbot to adjust the questions to what users were writing. So we used a language model to adapt the questions to the individual course of the conversation. So for each topic, there were 9 conversational turns, and the language model adapted the questions according to our instructions. In our case, we asked it to only ask questions about those topics, and we gave it some examples about questions that would be interesting to ask. So we had a chatbot that asks questions about death, leading to a personal reflection on death. And then we wanted to find out how this works in a real conversation. So we recruited participants online who received a link to access the chatbot. In total, we had 100 participants who used the chatbot and wrote an average of 436 words and interacted with the chatbot for an average of 24 minutes. We also stored and later analyzed the conversations they had with the chatbot and also collected additional data using questionnaires. Specifically, we asked them to complete the death attitude profile and the readiness for end-of-life conversation questionnaires before and after the chat. We also asked them to rate the chatbot after the chat. The death attitude profile and readiness for end-of-life conversation are interesting to us because they have some relevant subscales such as fear of death. So, am I worried about my own death? Do I try to push away the thoughts about death? Do I accept it as a normal part of life? And do I feel ready to talk about it with family and friends? So we wanted to know if the conversations with the chatbot would change any of these attitudes. Actually, we already had an hypothesis on how the chatbot could change the attitudes. So we thought that chatting with our chatbot about death would reduce fear of death, would reduce death avoidance, and could increase the natural acceptance of death and also make people feel more ready to discuss these kind of topics with family and friends. And this is the best part, this is actually what happened. So we compared the questionnaires before and after talking to the chatbot, and we saw that fear of death and death avoidance decreased, while neutral acceptance and readiness to talk about death increased. All in all, we found small but significant effects on attitudes toward death. We also looked at the correlations between the significant changes and subjective evaluations of the chatbot, as well as other chat statistics. We found some correlations between changes and the words that people wrote, and also the subjective evaluation of the chatbot and changes in attitude. For us, this suggests, tentatively of course, that the chatbot may have played a role in mediating the effects. To better understand what makes a conversation successful, we algorithmically analyzed the responses using a language model. So there were many questions. You might remember these 9 conversational terms. One of those questions could have been, do you hope your contribution will influence or perhaps inspire those in your life after you're gone? And then users wrote a response to this question. We grouped these responses into 2 groups. A group of users on whom the conversation had a positive effect, and a group of users who had little or low effect. Then we calculated the silhouette width for all the responses. That is basically a measure of how well one response fits into one group while not fitting into the other group. We could see that there are typical responses for the high effect group and typical responses for the low effect group. For example, on the left, we see that a typical response to this question from a person who experienced high effect could have been, I will hopefully leave them a substantial inheritance. Typical response for the low effect group might have been, it doesn't affect. So we could see that there are some differences in how people respond to these questions and how the conversations affected their attitudes. We did this for 8 questions, 2 of each topic, and we found that bigger changes in attitude correspond with longer and more reflective responses in the conversation, commitment to plans, finding meaning in death, and some notion of legacy or afterlife. This could be used to fine-tune conversations in the future so that they become more conducive to developing constructive attitudes towards death. What is still missing is an analysis of the individual conversations, which could reveal how people understood the chatbot and what roles and relationships they assumed, and at which point their conversations went well and where it didn't went so well. Also, the present study lacks a control group. It remains an open question what the actual control group should be. We could imagine to compare our chatbot with the chatbot that talks about unrelated topics, but we could also compare the chatbot to information provided on websites or leaflets. Might also be interesting to compare the chatbot to talking to a real person, such as a relative or professional. In future experiments, it could also be interesting to include variations of the chatbot and also vary the communication styles to find out which specific topics drive the effect. All in all, we found that talking about death has a positive effect, even when the conversation is with the chatbot. And this is good because talking to a chatbot is less of a barrier than having a similar conversation with family members or professionals, such as a psychologist or a priest. One could also imagine that a chatbot could mediate conversations with family members that become difficult. And this could be applied in a variety of settings, ranging from care planning to life reviews to digital legacies, all topics where it's very much important to talk about death and about the personal values and meanings that we ascribe to it. We hope that this study could inspire a constructive rather than avoidant relationship with our mortality. And if there's one thing I want to leave you with, then it's let's talk about death, whether you do it with a chatbot or a real person. I think it will be worthwhile. And if you want to read more about our article, it's in the SEM Digital Library. You can check it out here. And thank you very much for your attention.